I want to hit got it.
All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences Grand Rounds. Topic of today's Grand Rounds is emotional relationship, therapy of fear, security, more important than safety. For continuing education, please enter EATS code 04GAED. Today's presentation is by Dr. Veenstra. He received his master's and PhD in adult clinical psychology from the Michigan State University. Throughout his career, Dr. Veenstra has been involved in leadership in many clinics and practices. He came to the University of Kansas, Wichita in 1979, where he is currently an associate professor with the Department of Psychiatry. Dr. Veenstra has long been interested in teaching psychiatry residents, for which he's received multiple Teacher of the Year awards. Dr. Veenstra does not have any relevant commercial financial arrangements related to the content of his presentation today. Feel free to submit questions through the chat, which I will give to Dr. Veenstra at the end of the presentation. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Veenstra.
Thank you, Dr. Armstrong. Am I coming through all right? Okay. I appreciate all of you sharing this time with me. I've enjoyed Grand Rounds through the years, and today I'm going to bring you up to date on where I'm working presently in terms of understanding fear and anxiety. I've developed a model that's one of my life's work, and I'm going to be taking you through it today. It's the self-system levels of functioning model. It's a meta theory, and I'll be explaining it to you in a minute. But it's different than the usual because it's not like CBT cognitive, it's a very emotional theory. It's about particularly emotional relationships, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today. It's also different in the sense that the patient that I'm going to use for this discussion is a very familiar patient, myself. I am a good example of the driven dismissive personality style or emotional solution style that I'll talk about in a minute. I was a very anxious child. I led most of my life up through adolescence, fearful of relationships, and for the most part, escaping into intellectual pursuits to find relief and excitement in life. I did well scholastically and went to Iowa State University to become a chemical engineer. There I discovered I really like to build models, and you'll see that today. Though intellectually challenging, chemical engineering didn't have that personal appeal. And struggling with anxiety a lot myself, I began to read about psychodynamics, and I was excited to say, there's a way to understand why I feel this way. And I became captivated enough that in the midpoint of my career, I began to add psychology courses in so I could go to graduate school at Michigan State as a clinical psychologist. This was much to the chagrin of my professors. They couldn't understand why their graduating scholar in the College of Engineering would want to be a psychologist. Such a soft, easy thing instead of the rigor of chemical engineering. My father reacted by disinheriting me because I was giving up the career that he could never have. Fortunately, that only lasted 1 week. I don't know what my mother said, but he stopped that. But he remained displeased with me throughout my life because I wasn't an engineer. But I have no regrets. I've enjoyed being a therapist, both to myself and others. And I've enjoyed teaching. And today you're going to see my enjoyment of theory. So I want to share highlights of this work with you today. And let me bring the screen up. Okay. So hopefully you can see that what I'm talking about is an anxious, insecure child, became intellectually involved, went to engineering, built models, but because I was interested in my own anxiety, it shifted into psychology. And today you're going to see that model, the SSLF model. These are my objectives for the presentation. I will be introducing you to that model, which is a meta theory, meaning that it can handle many other theories. And I'll be using it to explain what emotion is, and how emotion functions. I will explain how emotion solves not only behavioral problems, but emotional problems, and in particular, the problem of fear. I'll be illustrating how the security in the parenting relationship plays a crucial role in learning that regulatory process. And finally, I'll be talking about how to use emotion in therapy. So my first objective is to give you a brief overview of the self-system levels of functioning model, and in particular, explain what emotion is and how it functions. This is the SSLF model. When you look at it, you will be overwhelmed, most people are, and say, oh my gosh. Don't worry, I am not going to try to explain in detail this model. I'm going to fly at 5,000 feet and give you an overview of the model, following the major road that runs through it, which is highlighted by that orange box, which has to do with emotional and relational functioning. Just listen to my words, look down, and you'll see the diagrams. They give a background, but don't worry about trying to particularly understand all of them. I'm asking that you hold your questions to the end because this is a rather ambitious undertaking, and Dr. Armstrong will collect them and give them to me at that point in time. So let me start by giving you just some basic assumptions about the model and how it emphasizes emotion. If you look at this model, up the middle is what I call its trunk that produces what I call the levels of self, and to each side are a set of branches. So this model is built to be a growth model. It moves up this way, and it is built on some basic assumptions. The main one is that to understand the brain and the mind, I'm going to use the best analogy we have at this time, which is the computer. And so the model's base is the computer's hardware, the neuroscience of its synapses and circuits. It turns out that our brain is so complex, it takes 20 years to wire it, and it actually is brought on in layers as it grows. And so those layers create the levels of self. Each level of maturation brings on a new computer operating system, if you will, with its unique language and operations. And that in then turn is used to develop the software. The mind is the software of the computer. The brain is the hardware. And we're going to explore particularly what you learn to do about emotion and how you respond to it. But the model also has another branch, which is the modes of eye consciousness. It turns out that your brain not only learns things, but it learns to be the operator of your brain. It becomes the basis for structuring your personality. Now, I won't be spending a lot of time on that today, but it will enter as an important part of the process. Interestingly, this model can handle the concepts of CBT and psychodynamics, and you'll see that as we move forward. So to give you a sense of it, as the brain matures, it brings on 4 major modes of functioning associated with 4 different parts of the brain's functioning. We enter the world with what Paul MacLean would call a reptilian brain that functions by executing things. It's an executing mode. The stimulus triggers the response. At about 2 years old, the mammalian cortex, the part of the cortex that we share with mammals, begins to come online. And what differentiates it is it has cortical loops that you'll learn about, which enable us at this level to begin to make choices instead of automatically executing. All of this is what I will call action processing. And implicit action processing means it's unconscious. That's a huge dividing line in this model, because at about 4 years old, the explicit information processing system comes online because the human cortical loops are beginning to come online. First the concrete and then the abstract. This enables you to cognitively solve problems and envision solutions that you've never seen before. So this is the basic growth. The brain is maturing. As it matures, it brings these layers on. And it turns out each of the layers splits into a direct action executing and a meta controlling process to create the 8 levels of selves that you see there. Now, as you look at them, you'll see some familiar names like emotion and body and things like that. But there's some other names that are different. The levels describe what they do. But to help you understand them, it's better to start with a part that you understand. This is CBT, and CBT has parts of self, it has body sensations, behaviors, feelings, and thoughts, which are broken down into automatic and conscious thoughts. And the interesting thing about CBT is it assumes that those thoughts are, for the most part, what is controlling and driving your feelings, if you will. So the levels up here are just different parts of your experiential functioning. And in the SSLF model, there's some overlaps. There's a body, there's behavior, there's feelings, there's thinking, but you'll notice some things that are different. There's a self and there's an ego. Those are concepts that aren't big in CBT. It doesn't conceptualize dynamics, but they're built into this model. And there's some interesting parts in here that I call the transition zones that I'll be explaining later. But the important takeaway here is that in this model, feelings is more often driving the other parts of the system. So this is my quick overview of that SSLF model. And hopefully you have a sense of that brain is maturation is producing the levels, and the levels are part of self. We're going to focus on the emotion, and we want to understand now what is emotion and how does it work. So to begin with, emotion is the language that uses feelings as representations of the meta information about a person's life experience. Now let me stop there. That's kind of jargony. So think of feelings as the words of this language. Meta information means they are words attached to one's experience. So if you meet a dog and get frightened by the dog, the fear becomes meta information that when attached at a meta level to the dog, when you meet the dog again, it will remind you that this is a fearful animal, and this is what you need to do to focus, to adapt to it. How do you respond to it? So emotion is an action processing language. It attaches feelings that tell you how to respond to the situation. And it has a lot of different forms of functioning. It enables you to recognize what's likely to happen in the situation. You can consider and compare plans on how to respond. And you can choose which of those plans you're going to execute. And as you're executing it, the emotion will help direct and motivate you to accomplish it. And we'll look at something pretty important. It enables you to choose on the basis of 2 important things in action processing: the outcome, what will happen, and the probability of success. If I do that, what's the likelihood I can really run away from the dog, if you will? And finally, emotion is very powerful in helping you to remember things. So if it's a language, it has parts of speech, and here are the parts of speech, and you'll notice that one of the least used parts of speech, interjection, is pure emotion. But the emotion we're going to be looking at today is in this band here. It's the verbs that we use because emotions create the verbs of the action processing language. They create a sense of being and a sense of active processing. So they are part of the right hemisphere. Now, most of us are most familiar with the left hemisphere. It does information processing much like a computer. It thinks. That's a rather slow, suspended processing, using words to decide what is better to use. It is the last of the levels to develop. The last 3 are Piaget's operations. They are in late childhood and adolescence, but our brain is actually using them from earlier on. And this is an explicit processing. We are conscious of ourselves thinking, and we not only think about the present, but the past and the future. Now, the right hemisphere is very different. It's an action processing system, choosing feelings as its words. And it's a very fast, immediate system that's trying to help you respond to a particular situation. And most of its processing is implicit or unconscious. Now, there's a lot of different characteristics between the right and the left hemisphere. I'm not going to talk about them all, but we're going to be looking at the fact that they actually make decisions very differently. And we'll talk more about that. And they also have very different sources of memory. The left uses factual knowledge memory. The right is autobiographical experience memory. So there are two different language systems that process very differently. The left you're familiar with. When you have a situation, you can bring into your working memory plans about what you could do, consciously thinking about them, using in your reasoning and your logical sequences of what it could happen to evaluate. Notice this has an E in front of it. And these plans are stored for future action. You don't necessarily have to act on them. You can just think about things. On the other hand, the right hemisphere pops into your awareness a possible action in the present situation with an urging to execute. You should do this. And considerations on how that plan was formed are totally unconscious. The associative process is beyond your awareness. You just are aware that it pops. And once it pops, you have a choice whether to execute it or not. And you're having to do it in real time. And its words are feelings. So how are feelings created? I'm going to try to move a title bar here over there. Yeah. Feelings are created by two different levels. This is level 2 in the model, the level of brain nuclei. And for fear, amygdala is the nucleus that is very involved in producing the amygdala alarm signal, which triggers a reflexive flee response, and you feel it associated with physiological arousal. It's triggered and it does all this automatically. That's hardwired. But the interesting thing is that signal is sent up to the emotional cortex, particularly the anterior cingulate. The cingulate attaches the words, the emotional words of the mind, if you will, like fear. Based on this, it will attach it to the dog in the situation. You have an identifier. Instead of having an alarm signal, you have a feeling, which creates an urge, a disposition to act in a particular way, fleeing, if you will. And then it produces the valuation, which is how you decide what I want to do. And it can measure intensity. So, where's my cursor? So in terms of the elements are produced by the brain. They're not learned from somebody else. The brain knows how to produce these basic feelings, and it's attaching them. The difference between the basic feelings is recognized, which makes them identified in the brain. I'm frightened. No, I'm safe. The feelings are the identifiers, and they will have different dispositional directions. Disposition is bigger than a response. It's a tendency to do something. And to make those decisions, there are two important comparative measures. Valuation, which measures the profitability of the outcome. I've encountered a dog. Will I be hurt and injured? Will it be painful? Will it be something that I will enjoy? That's the profitability of the outcome. And when you consider those actions, there's also a measure of, will those actions succeed? What's the likelihood that I'll escape injury or that I'll enjoy the dog? Valuation, no E. It's just evaluation and validation. So it turns out those two basic characteristics are used by the cortex in a remarkable looping process that you see on this diagram. It's very complex and it would take me a while to explain it. So the important thing you need to know is the brain is set up to measure not only the valuation, by one pathway, but also the validation by the other, and come up with what's the profitability and what's the probability. And it uses that to make decisions. Now, what it is set up in the mammalian brain can do it, and all the cortical brain levels can do it. They can compare competing responses. And in the mammalian brain, they're comparing to see which one is most emotionally important to use, using valuation and validation to make that decision. So it runs each of the responses through its loops, weighs those two things, and then compare the two and decide which one is the most beneficial and which one am I most likely to be able to do. And if it's not really happy with either of them, it sends them through the loops again, because the cortex could alter the loop, change the plan, and then it gets evaluated against by this looping system. If none of the plans ever become worthy, it can stop the process and say, we're not going to do it. Okay. But if one does seem much better than the other, then the person can say, valuation and validation are good enough, execute. And this system sends it to the motor system to automatically execute. You've got a 10-minute course in emotions. Hopefully that gives you the overview. This is the remarkable action processing language of the right hemisphere. You've learned how emotions are created and how it makes decisions. So now what we need to do is ask, how does emotion, which has this wonderful operational system to make those decisions, how does it solve problems, especially problems with fear? So this is the emotional problem-solving process. I, as a toddler, meet a dangerous dog, and that situation activates a state of being verb called afraid. That's the state of my being. I'm worried about this, which then turns on an action verb to solve the problem. Fear is one of the main action verbs. It motivates my effort to escape. It's used to choose which one works, and it provides the energy for the process. That's the reason it's in bold. If I successfully avoid the dog, then I experience another state of being verb, relief. I'm safe, and the process is terminated. It turns on, acts, and turns off. Emotion does that automatically for you. And these verbs are what are making the decision in this process. So it turns out the basic solution emotions that mammals have are fourfold, like the cardinal points of a compass. There's desire and anger, which are both very active forms of emotion. And there's help, cry, and fear, a passive form. So notice there's an active passive dimension and a positive negative. Desire seeks positive, anger attacks negatives, if you will. These four systems are built into the mammalian brain and provide four different dispositional directions. It's not a single reflex like flee, it's a whole set of behaviors that would include hiding and lots of other things. And the interesting thing about the mammalian brain is when these situations are encountered, one of these particular emotions will usually be triggered as far as what should I do? And the mammalian brain will begin a trial and error process using these four solutions to deal with the situation. So imagine a dog in the learned helplessness experience locked in a cage with the floor being electrified. It is likely to seek and look around and try to figure out how does it get out. Seeking a desirable way, it's likely to run to see if it can get away. Well, the doors are locked. That doesn't work. It can get angry at the doors and snap at them. It can begin to whine and cry and ask the experimenter to let them out. And the mammal will be trying a whole series of these sequentially to see which one works. These are the basic solution emotions. They solve behavioral problems. This is the anatomical diagram of where they are located in the brain. And this is Pansep's diagram from effective neuroscience. Notice he's saying there are 4 primary emotional operating systems, genetically wired, well-organized, stimulated by centers in the brain. Now, it's not quite the same description, but this is the basis for my model. We're interested in fear, and 2 of the nuclei are very important in that fear. The amygdala is the nuclei demonstrated here that looks for danger, the presence of threat. It asks, do I feel safe or unsafe? If you feel unsafe, and also if you feel uncertain, the amygdala is likely to activate freezing or fleeing as its innate responses. It's concerned with safety. Up here across the stria terminalis is the septal nuclei, which responds to separation fear. Where is mother? That's not the presence of danger. That's the absence of support. When mother is not around, one feels insecure. And interestingly, right next to the septal is the bed nuclei of the stria terminalis, where anxiety is generated. So notice, feeling insecure is very much related to anxiety, but both, if you have this sense of continuing anxiety about the amygdala, you can also have danger anxiety. This, however, is associated more with security. Most of CBT works on safety. I'm going to be talking about security because it's the more relational of the fears. If you look at the amygdala, you learn a basic element about how the brain wires. It turns out that it has always 2 separate switches. There's an on switch and an off switch, and they are different. One is excitatory, the other is inhibitory. The excitatory always wires first. The inhibitory comes on second as its controller, direct and meta, if you will. So at the amygdala's level, survival responding, you get this activation that says run, flee, and through behavioral conditioning, stimuli become associated and become capable of triggering those run responses. Unfortunately, in the human infant, once the on switch is turned on, the infant does not have the brain power to turn on by itself a security signal. It has to borrow that from a mother. That's the reason for the help cry, because when the mother comes, there's a center in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex that functions as an off switch. And when she's there, the frightened child can begin to feel secure, even though the situation might be dangerous. So notice this is learned more by parental modeling. It comes on later. So this is basic to all the emotions, but we're mainly going to be following it fear. So to back up a second, most of the time we're solving behavioral problems. How do I flee the dog? Where's mother? What if the problem is an emotional problem? How do you solve the problem of fear itself? And fear itself easily becomes a problem because the human brain is built so that if the fear is not terminated by relief, it will feed back on itself. Emotions will begin to wind up. When the child is frightened and cries out and mother doesn't come, the child will cry louder and louder and louder because the child cannot turn this off. So how does the brain try to solve those problems? It's still in a very primitive state. It solves it by pairing other emotions. It does emotional conditioning. When fear is conditioned to itself, it creates a problematic emotion. There's nothing more fearful than fear itself. And when it combines these, it produces what I call the problematic emotional solution emotion. A solution emotion is a combination emotion that has been modifies, one motion that modifies the other. So the problem The problem is that the fear, when it feeds on itself, creates a problem. And how do you turn it off? Remember, systems are made as opposing actions. This is avoidance. Across the way is approach. It turns on the emotion that is best at turning off fear is actually the approach emotion out of the accumbens. And so if you pair it, you provide the corrective emotion, if you will, and it produces a new emotion, courage. Courage is a combination of approach and a fear together. So the brain is going to create solution emotions, combination emotions that modify each other. And there's 4 of them. And if you put them in a diamond formation, you rotate that little square I showed you before a bit, and you put at the bottom the problem emotion in itself, that's always the problem. Any emotion paired with itself is problematic. Across from it in the diamond will be the correction emotion, which is the opposite. And this creates a progression of development, individual growth. Children come into the world with a very primitive fear reaction to almost everything. And as they learn to pair it with courage, they begin to master it. This is what we're going to focus on in this session. There's another dimension called the relational assistance dimension. It doesn't actually solve the problem, but it helps them solve. So when you're a child that's frightened, if you cry to mother, she will come and help you, and it's easier to develop courage. Now, on the other hand, if you cry and are doing stupid things, you might bring father that says, stop it, you're making a problem. Fear, anger, and help cry are responses that pull people into the situation to deal with it. So these are the solution emotions. So we've had basic emotions, solution emotions. We've got one more step we need to do to develop regulation. It turns out that when the child starts in life, they're usually confused and they don't know what to do. Typically in anxiety, that's the paralysis state. What am I going to do? I don't know. But children are built with a simple startup solution. So rather than just saying frozen, the solution usually for most dangerous situations is to run. That's anxieties, that's fears, automatic starting solution. It's an excitatory, positive goal. Get out of there. And children quickly learn this. Now, the problem is they're often running from things they don't need to run. And parents will begin to say, whoa. So notice the emotion is being balanced with its opposing emotion. And the parent is saying, no, you really need to face the danger and approach. But initially, the child's going to say, yeah, are you crazy? The dog is dangerous. So you have a power struggle between the two of these. This is always at the direct level. A higher level is going to come online, and it's going to regulate both of these and make them work together to create a coordinated switching, not just complete fleeing or complete approach, but a balanced combination. Notice 2 solution emotions up here, the problematic one and the corrective one, both and rather than either or. So this diamond I call the developmental diamond because it is what is used to shift between levels at every stage of the SSLF model. Whenever you're transitioning from one level to the other, the brain is essentially doing this operation of combining 2 responses into an integrated team. So the process usually moves. The infant learns what comes naturally in the beginning and will try to use it all the time. It's harder for the child to learn that there is an opposite, and the parent is trying to help them learn it. But once it learns that the opposite is important, then it can begin to learn to create how a system that works together. So essentially, the levels that you see in the SSLF model are how the brain goes about coordinating that process. It starts with fear, just feeding back on itself and amplifying. It takes a while. This is not the best modification. I don't have time to explain it here, but usually what children move to is they become convinced running away is the solution. Now, that's a solution in a primitive sense, but it needs to take a leap and recognize the opposite emotion. Can it correct it? And once it recognizes that, it can begin to recognize how to move the two together and finally integrate them. Now, I've colored these three because I briefly want to illustrate how they develop. So here that diagram is arranged in the levels of the model. It's only 6 because it turns out that at the first level of the SLF, there is no interpersonal process. The baby's just learning to keep its body alive. So it drops out. And the 8th level is usually related to transcendent things like spirituality. So in relationship, these are the 6 that are usually important. So down at the bottom here, we have the uncontrolled amplifying basic emotions. And here they are. And notice they aren't connected. They don't make a team. They each do their own thing. We're focusing on fear disorders, which is huge in psychiatry. We have a lot of addiction disorders. Notice addictions are caused, cocaine makes a very rewarding experience. When you become desiring a desirable experience, you can set up an addiction, if you will. The DSM has a couple of anger disorders. It doesn't have any pity disorders, which is unfortunate because a lot of our patients have pity problems. But the child enters the world with these 4 basic emotions, and all they need to know to solve themselves is just feedback on themselves. Okay. But as they begin to learn to pair them, they begin to learn to develop solution emotions. And it turns out these 4 become 4 very different styles of handling fear. We're going to be looking at the driven dismissive today, which is essentially a person who says, no fear, I need to escape into an activity. Notice these are the 2 positives. Both of them have a line and a downward facing parallelogram to say they are both trying to shut down fear by doing an opposite kind of reaction. On the other side of this line are the passive ones. Here's fearful avoiding, which is what I was as a child most of the time. You have high fear and the fear is being used to try to stop it. Not a good combination. Over here you have the helpless needer, the child that has high fear, but by crying to mother brings a rescuer to the situation. If you look at these look very much like the attachment styles. There's a pretty direct parallel, but the difference is the solution emotions are much broader than just simple attachment. So we're going to follow one of these. There isn't time to follow more. This is me. I'll tell you more about me in a minute. Okay, so in the driven dismissive, what the person tries to do when they are fearful is to reject it. There's no reason to be afraid. And they distract themselves by focusing on an external problem that they can solve. And they put their anxious energy into succeeding. And if they do, they have a sense of relief. The unfortunate thing is they really didn't deal with the underlying fear. They just ignored and denied it. And that's what creates the insecurity that characterizes this level. They are only secure as long as this activity is more powerful and blocks out the fear. If you begin to fail and this activity doesn't work well, you will fall back down in experiencing the underlying fear. That's my particular style, and I will tell you more about it later. Now, there is a solution to these. At the top of this diagram is what a mature person would be like. And notice in this diagram, the squares are up and down, and the bottom one says, okay, fear. All of these emotions are not panicked by fear. They know how to deal with it. They deal with it appropriately. They shift back and forth, which is what this diagram represents. There are times when it is reasonable to run from the dog and the person feels very comfortable doing it. There's other times that they know the dog is a false fear and they need to master and have the courage to overcome it. And here are the parental coping. This is a maturely adaptive style. And notice now we have a team of emotions that works together in a coordinated manner. The child has grown up. So we've accomplished a quick overview of how the brain solves problems with emotion. It starts with 4 basic emotions. When the emotion becomes a problem, it begins to pair the emotion with another emotion to create a solution emotion. And then it uses a pair of solution emotions in coordination to control the process. What I'm going to suggest next is, you notice the driven dismissive was insecure. The security of the parent teaching the child how to do this will actually determine how they develop their own style. So we're going to look at that next. So if you look at this diagram, notice the child comes into the world as a helpless infant. The world is dangerous and they can't take care of themselves. So parents provide what they can't do and protect them from what they can't protect themselves against. So as long as the child can't do something itself, the parent supplements, if you will. But once the child does it for themselves, the parent backs away and lets the child venture further and further out into life until the child eventually is taking care of themselves and becoming a capable adult, is no longer a child. Now, the SSLF model actually breaks that parenting process down into 8 levels. There is a body sustaining level because the infant comes into the world a helpless needer. They don't even know how to feed themselves. They need a mother to tend to their needs. Each of these levels has a different set of roles because parenting changes as the child's maturation changes. We're going to be looking at these 2 particularly. At level 4 here, you're going to have a parent that tells the child what to do and the child does it. It's an authoritative relationship. Boss, leader, follower, director, doer. Crossing this important boundary, parents begin to be advisors who help their children make their decisions. A huge transition in functioning. It depends on having more cognitive capacity, but this sets up the basic situation we're going to deal with. The parenting tasks, therefore, start with presence down here. The child has a problem. This is the bottom of the diamond. And the parent comes in with comforting support and understanding empathy, helps them to understand this, and then moves into providing what they can't provide for themselves. And in that process, modeling what the child will need to learn to do for themselves. The process then shifts across as the child learns this. The parent who's been protecting them from dangers and from their own impulses begins to relax the protection and let them move out into the world more so they can try to do it themselves. As they learn to do it themselves, the parent promotes them. You're doing it, I will turn responsibility over to you. So this diagram generally moves in this zigzag fashion that you'll see in the diamonds: presence, provision, protection, promotion. It does that at every one of the levels because every level is a new set of tasks that they need to learn. So the major thing we want to look at is if you have a parent who's stuck at a level. Now I've gone back to the emotional levels. A driven dismissive is this rigid controlling level. If the parent is at that level, the child is likely to not be able to develop further because the parent doesn't know how to model these up here. They don't know how to provide them. So we're going to be looking at a maladaptive case, my own upbringing, and a mature case, which hopefully I've moved towards some as I've grown and matured. So what I'm going to do is take you through the task, hopefully quickly enough that we can get there, and talk about how the parenting is different in these two states. So we're going to begin with the driven dismissive. And I'm going to say this because that's me and that's my mother. In the driven dismissive state, the parent feels like their job is to tell the child what to do. And they see themselves as what I call a positional power authority. I'm the person who makes the decision. I'm the one that should tell you what to do. And interestingly, the problem is a cognitive behavioral problem. You just don't know the right thing. Once I've told you and you do it, the problem is solved, right? They listen to the child briefly, but as soon as they figure it out, they shift from listening to telling them how to fix it. They don't need any more information. The parent's the authority. I can tell you how to deal with it. Notice there's no emotional relationship here. The parent doesn't tune in, is not empathic. The word in the parenting literature is attunement. There's no emotional connection. They simply tell the child what they're doing, and typically they do it in an all or none way, right or wrong. And they tell the child, you shouldn't be feeling that way. They reject the emotion of fear. And the solution is simple. Don't be afraid. If you've ever seen Bob Newhart and his famous line, the solution is stop it. Okay. And the implication is if you continue to do it, you're doing wrong, and that's not a good thing. My mother never used nasty terms like this, but my father would use, don't be a sissy. Why are you afraid, right? The child's feeling is being invalidated. So this is the parent not really tuning in, trying to move the child to be grown up. And in the next step, the provision step, they actually begin to tell the child what to do to solve the problem. And if you're a driven dismissive, you focus on the task of doing what I'm telling you. You should channel all your energy into doing it well. And in fact, if you make this task important enough, it'll distract you from your fear. You won't feel it anymore if you're involved in this task. Classic examples are whistling through the graveyard and white knuckling it. The fear hasn't gone away, but you're overriding it with another more powerful emotion. So you need to do, child, what I'm going to tell you to do. And notice the parent is largely using their expectations to set that bar. They're not as tuned into the child. They didn't gather a lot of information to the child. And from where they see, the solution's pretty simple. All you have to do is not be afraid of the fear. And in fact, you should do that, okay? Now, the trouble with this parent, if you're my mother and actually my father is a disgusted disapprover. He uses anger as his override. My mother tries to get you to do good things. She's a driven dismissive. And outwardly, she models that behavior. But if you are emotionally close, you'll notice that underneath my mother's surface is an insecurity. And it turns out that bottom 4 layers, there is an emotional mirroring process that takes place. And children can pick up that even though mother is saying, I can do this, there's this underlying fear underneath. And what they get by mirroring their mother is not confidence, but actually an underlying insecurity. They're not learning anything about fear. They're just learning to cover it over. So when the parent feels like they've taught them how to do it, they've provided, they can begin to relax protection. And the dismissive parent tends to sort of say, you're on your own, you got it, I told you what to do. But the biggest problem, and this is the stage where the conflict comes in, is the child usually doesn't feel able to do it. It's too scary, too hard. You don't care about me, and they begin to resist. And this is really where you'll learn how secure your parent is. Because an insecure parent takes this as a personal attack on their authority and caring. This attack will trigger their underlying insecurity and bring it to the surface because they feel the child is failing to take their wise advice, they're doing the wrong thing and they need to be corrected. Now, my mother started out very nice about that, and she would just try to reassert, just do it. Just, I told you, you can do it. But as I become more emotionally intense and resistant, she's likely to use her authority to put more, you will do it, more power into that assertion. And if I begin to accuse her of not understanding and you're not a good mother, she's likely to begin to say, you're not a good child. And she's likely to begin to chat back. She can't maintain her differentiation. She's saying, I should be able to do it up here. But in the bottom 3 levels below that big divider, if you have failure at one level, you clank down to the very bottom. And in the end, you will want to leave the relationship. And that's where the parent really gains power, because being abandoned is a very frightening thing. So actually, in the effort to get the child to do it, they're beginning to reinforce the very things that will reproduce insecurity in the child. The child is not likely to gain confidence from this kind of management. Now, the child, when it comes to promotion, it's sad if they don't, but there's a strong incentive for them to do what a mother asks, because parental abandonment is usually a greater fear than the dog. Yeah, I don't want to go to the dog, but I certainly don't want to lose you, mother. So the child is likely to outwardly comply and inwardly denial. And when they do that, the parent will reward them because after all, they're doing the right thing. And the child will have a relief. My parent likes me. But if you look at the underlying level in the driven dismissive, the fear hasn't been changed a bit. In fact, it's been arrested at a very primitive level. As long as the child is able to accomplish this compensatory task, they have a sense of security, but it's actually an insecure sense of safety. And as soon as that successful achieving begins to fail, they have the risk that they'll fall down. So essentially, they're being expected by their parent to take a huge leap. And if it fails, it'll be a huge fall. So this is the driven dismissive process. Now, let me stop for a second and give you an example of my upbringing that would help you understand this. As a 5-year-old child, I was headed off to kindergarten, and my mother was a full-time housekeeper, and she walked me the mile to school. I don't know that that's common for parents in this day and age, but she walked me as a 5-year-old the mile to school. She stayed the first day. I went home at noon. The next day, she walked me to school again, and she said, you now know the way. I've got laundry to do. You can get home yourself. Well, when I walked out of the building and saw the first set of crossing guards, I was paralyzed. That's part of the anxiety that I carry. And I said, I don't remember how to get home. I finally had to choose a street because the crossing guards were left. So I impulsively went down the street, fortunately the right way, but I didn't know that. All that long first 3/4 of the mile, I was terrified. I was doing it. Was I going to be lost? Would my mother be able to find me? Fortunately, at a corner, I recognized with my implicit memory a spruce tree. I know that tree. I'm supposed to turn here. And I did, and hurried home and ran into the house and was tearful and upset and said to my mother, I was so scared. I didn't know how to find my way home. And she said, you made it. You're all right. Now I've got work to do. Go play. Does that give you a sense of how a dismissive, driven mother, the work is very important to my mother. She's reassured me. I was fine. I made it home. Did I learn anything about emotion? Did she understand it? No. So I became what a driven dismissive is. Outwardly, I spent a lot of effort becoming a good child, which is the reason I did schoolwork real well. But inside there was this lingering anxiety, which I was very conscious of, that at times would break out in just plain overwhelming anxiety and paralysis. I used to have what I call the abyss experiences, just dropping down into that confused state. Does that give you a sense of how this style was learned? Now, what you need to know is that's exactly how my mother was parented by her family growing up. She's not doing this out of cruelty. That's all she knew. She's doing what she knew. So this is the problem. Now, let me give you the adaptive parent. This parent, on the other hand, doesn't come on as a director. They come on as advisor. Let me help you think about how to solve this situation. My authority drives not from my power, but from my consequences. And the problem isn't a simple cognitive behavior. It's an emotional maturity problem. It's understandable that you don't know how. I need to help you grow up. So this parent spends time trying to listen to the child, empathizing with them, becoming attuned. In the process, they're learning how the child actually experiences the situation. And because they accept the child's feelings, they're normalizing. And by feeding them back, they're helping them to label them. And if I had this kind of parent, I would learn, oh, this is understandable. Now, there is a mature way the parent would be saying, but you're not wrong to feel this way. Trust me, I can help you. Presence is actually one of the places you will most notice the difference between parenting styles. And John Gottman, in his book on how to raise an emotionally healthy child, would say this step is the crucial step that differentiates these two parenting styles. So when it comes to providing, this parent can model, and they will often say, I felt like that when I went to school. It's not uncommon, but trust me, you can grow. But because they know the child better, they'll ask the child to only take small, doable steps. They'll be risky, but they'll be doable, not too big. So they'll often give the child a set of choices. So the child has a way, if you can't do this, then we may have to. So it's not like the child is given a forced choice, if you will, but the child has a sense of choice. And the parent says with real confidence, I'm confident you can succeed, in part because they have succeeded. Their confidence is a calm, secure confidence, and they have learned how to modify fear. So they're providing a good example, which will be important because once they begin to back off, that's when the child will say, I'm not ready, I'm too scared, I'm too frightened. And they will begin that attack on parents. You're too hard, you don't understand, you don't care for me. This parent's response is very different. They don't lose their position and drop down and become more destructive. They can listen, they go back and validate again, but they essentially end up staying at the same place. I'm confident that you can do it. And they may, in fact, modify the situation a little bit to make it more adaptive to the child. But in the end, they will try to push the child to make a step forward, but they will not become feeling unloved. They will not have to attack back against the parent, and they will not lose their confidence in their solution by getting more desperate to make it work. So they will encourage small steps. They'll step back, but they don't actually go away. They are watching. And what they monitor is how well is the child doing it. And they're trying to hit a balance point. They're not using an unrealistic expectation. When they realize the child's fear and frustration is beginning to overwhelm their confidence, they're likely to say, we did it. You did it. You made progress. Because small steps that succeed are better than big steps that attempt but fail. So this child learns from this progress. And if they fail, the parent doesn't make it a big deal. It's not uncommon to fail. And they essentially move forward and do a process that has many small steps. The parent is a secure base, as the literature talks about, that the child can move out from. And then as they begin to reach the point where they don't want to face it anymore, they can come back to the safe harbor. This is a continuous circle of security. Hopefully this is giving you an understanding of these two styles. Now there's a lot of them, but I can only do two in this short presentation, and I'm running along here and need to finish up. Notice the parents' modeling is terribly important in this process. And so what I want to do now is talk about how you actually use emotion in therapy. Notice that the first example is what you need to know when you're working with patients. You need to know how those nasty dilemmas in their life got formed. That's the reason you gather history and listen to them. And if you understand the principles of the model, you'll be able to put it together better. And if you look at the second person, the mature adaptive, hopefully as a therapist, that's how you relate to your patients. That's a good relationship, isn't it? An advisor who listens, adapts, helps them make choices. So this is actually woven into our therapy. But notice, for the most part, I've described this totally in emotional terms. It's not a huge cognitive process. It's an emotional process that we now need to learn about. So the basic problem with fear, if we put it in the SSLF model, is actually at level 2, the survival responding level. The amygdala alarms to the situation and turns on the flee response and triggers the fear. And if the parent is not there to provide emotional security, the fear feeds back on itself. There's no turning off. It feeds back, it amplifies, and it grows and spreads and short circuits all the higher levels. That's the fear problem. The solution, of course, is turning on the contractive emotion. It's not cognitive. But wise parents probably usually know what the cognitive solution is. What they don't know is how to communicate it effectively from the left hemisphere to the right. There's a huge gap. These are the bottom 3 in Piaget. These are the top 3. Right, left, big hole in the middle. This was called preoperational in its model. So how do you span that gap? CBT says essentially, you use your thinking to tell them the correct solution, and if they apply it over time, they will develop the emotion. They are going sort of like boom, boom, if you will. What they don't recognize is there are 2 important levels here, and this is important to understand in the therapy process. I call this one the experiential self, and this is the verbalized directives. Notice here's the diamond. Whenever you cross a barrier, you will find a diamond as you develop from reason thinking to emotional feelings. Okay. What am I doing? I'm almost there. So essentially what I want to suggest is the automatic thoughts of CBT are actually verbalized directives that are a special form of functioning that can translate feeling in thinking into feeling. If you know how to use these, you know how to meta control feelings. The experiential self is an explicit system that can turn feeling into thinking, and it can communicate with the mind. These 2 levels enable that communication to take place. Now, this is the I consciousness levels. I'm not going to do a lot with it, but what I'm going to suggest is that it introduces the fact that as you grow, you begin to have more and more control over your mind. We're going to be looking at this level, the imagined subjective self. It's the first level across the implicit explicit barrier. And we want to look at it because it plays an important role in allowing the emotional system down here to communicate with the mind up here. Okay. So if we go to it, it turns out that in solving a problem, you generally go from the top down. Your envisioning ego says, there's a possible new solution. And your observing ego weighs things and says, yes, let's try it out. And your reason thinking says, I'll refine the plan. And then you have to submit it to the imagining self to decide, is that something I want to do? And then you create the directives that will guide the plan. And the plan operates, the feelings do their job, succeed. If they're successful, You then begin to practice this new plan until it becomes automatically a part of you. All of these levels, once they're maturely developed, are a powerful team. Each is doing its job. Together they can solve problems. And these three levels, the emotion is the crucial part of the process. We're very aware as cognitive people how this part works. These are the parts I want to introduce you to today. So what is the imagining experiential self? This is an explicit level that's using autobiographical memories. And so it's using the experiences and it's beginning to organize them into a self-concept. They were only self-owned responses before. Now you get a self-concept that begins to put all this together and has a sense of, this is myself. My is the identifying information. It says this behavior is part of me. This space is terribly important because once you know who you are, decisions become so much easier. When mother gives you spinach and says, it's wonderful, your self-concept says, I hate spinach. You don't have to do a lot of baiting. You know what you want, and you certainly don't want spinach. The emotional experiential self compares ideas, and it's a filter to say, would this fit with what I want to do? Is what I wish to do? It protects a stable identity. So why is it important in therapy? Twofold. It's the level that can talk with words about what it's feeling. It can take the right hemisphere emotional experience and put it into words so it can be thought about by reasoned thinking. And even more importantly, it asks the question, is this something I myself want to do? If it isn't, it tends to reject it. It doesn't allow it to be empowered. It doesn't execute. It becomes just an intellectual idea stored in your factual left as a plan to be used. But think about it. When you've been given the diet and your head knows that it's great, what stops you from doing it? This level stops you. It says, I don't want to do that. I'm not giving up that. The self intervenes. And the self is an emotional system at this level that can control the emotional system below it. So even if you force a person to do something, and you can do that, because they're forced, it's not a self experience. It's a not self experience. It doesn't get into the self concept. So you will do it only as long as your therapist is telling you to do it, because it's not part of yourself. So this is really crucial. What I want to suggest to you is what good therapists do is they recognize there is a level of, does this work? And if they don't have that from the patient, they're not going to push. So when I throw out a suggestion for patients to do, I watch for their emotional reaction. And if they say matter-of-factly, okay, I know my chances of success are limited. I heard no emotion. I heard no ownership. When on the other hand, they say, you know what, that I kind of like that. I could do that. It passed the experiential self. It's been woven into their self. Its chances of execution are much higher. So that plays an important intervening role that this model makes clear. The second part are the verbalized directives. They are expressed with words, the verbalized part, but they're really emotional expressions, expressions of intentionality or willfulness. They are the imperative form of an action verb. It's not just do it, it's you will do it. It has a push to it that makes it a directive. The earliest of the verbalized directives is the child at 2 when they learn this level, who says no. No is not a cognitive statement. No is an emotional statement. I'm not going to do that. It's about action. The words are the symbolic expression of the intention, but it's the emotional feeling that empowers it. And interestingly, the mammalian brain is based to automatically pop interpretations of intentionality to mind. Have you ever tried to coax a dog into a cage and you've held out a treat and you've been your best self and the dog looks at you and says, "You're trying to trick me"? You see, animals respond to verbal directives. They are trying to figure out your intentionality. That is an emotional process. Dogs don't have a cognitive process. They can sense intentionality in you. These verbalized directives are doing that. So when the guy cuts you off, you don't think, the guy cut me off, therefore he's a rude guy. You actually pop into your mind, that rude blankety blank is trying to get in my way. Intentionality is an emotional process. Emotional directives are terribly important in the therapy process because they control the process. I use the metaphor, they're like a pail carrying water. The words are the pail and the water is the message. And if the words don't carry the emotional message, they don't carry anything. So part of what I'm saying to you is when you change automatic thoughts, so much work goes into, is it rational? The real question is it emotional and relational? That's the real question that a therapist needs to work on. So these are two things that are very important to take into account in therapy. So let me try, I know I'm reaching the end here, to give you an overview of the treatment plan and just a touch of a feeling of how it's used. So as a rigid dismissive, I'm stuck at this level 3. And whenever you're arrested at a level, the level below is where the conflict will be. Notice that this level, it's one way or the other. This is cooperative working. If you're into a power play, you're not into cooperation. You'll get a power struggle up here. So children that get arrested don't know how to do this level. So therapy is largely resolving the arrest. And if you know the model, you know what the problems are at each level. You know how to resolve them. So you're shifting them over so they can begin to consider the opposing point of view, which frees them up to begin to grow again. The final point I want to leave you with is it depends on how validated in the nature of this validation, how difficult this process is. If their thoughts are not self-validated, you can use what I call emotion solution therapy to teach skills. A lot of behavioral change does that. But if this solution is self-validated, you're messing with the personality structure and you need to deal with the relationships, which have usually sort of frozen that. You have to revise the self structure and shift through that. So in the emotional therapy model, the emotional solution side over here deals with behavioral change. The personality change side over here is built in because ego and self are built into the model. The advantage of this model is you can shift gears. I usually start doing this, and when I hit things where they can't do it, why can't you do that? I'm usually going to have to shift into a relational focus. So we're going to be mainly using these things in the developmental process. I want to do only 2 final things, and I need to because I'm going to run out of time here. I want to get back to that safety versus security issue. In terms of change, CBT models use largely extinction conditioning to do it, and they use behavioral repetition. If you relax and face your situation again and again and again, you'll learn to feel safe. Now what they're saying is they are actually draining the draining the fear out of the stimulus. You don't need to fear it. You pair relaxation, you're relaxed, you're safe. Safe places are important. That does work. But what I'm going to suggest to you is once you understand emotion, you need to know that emotional reorganization is even more powerful because it's focused on increasing the positive. It's not draining the negative. It's not turning off the on switch. It's turning on the off switch. Sounds complicated, but that's what it is. You're trying to increase confidence in coping. And the interesting thing, a powerful reorganization doesn't require repetition. You can have it happen in one instance. So let me give you an example and we'll end on that point today. Growing up, I was very conscious of the fact that I was anxious most of the time, which would come out as trembling. It turns out I have an essential tremor, so that's even easier. And I was usually so aware that that was a bad sign. I was an anxious kid. My father used to make fun of that. So I would try hard to stop it. Have you ever tried to stop a tremor? It gets worse. Now, if I used a safety approach, I should just try to relax and not tremor, and keep trying to relax and not tremor. There's some sense to it, but it takes a very long time. There's another way, and that's actually how I made the change. And I want to introduce you to you. Notice the original emotion pairing was fear of fear. If you actually pair courage with fear, and the courage is strong enough, it can flip that switch. And that's what happened to me. In graduate school, I was frying chickens at Kentucky Fried Chicken to earn a little extra money. And you have to drop the chicken from trays into these boiling pots. And the high school student working with me said, "You're shaking, what's wrong with you?" Now, I could have responded to him like my father, but I was at a point in my career where I could turn to him and say, "Yep, I always shake. It's part of who I am, but I can fry chicken." And I dropped the chicken into the fryer. I had a sense of not having to run from my fear. I could own it and accept it. And I could feel it was right, all right. I could approach my fear and own it. That was a powerful moment. That moment changed my response to being criticized for being anxious. That was not accomplished by behavioral repetition. It was accomplished by emotional reorganization. Now, there are a couple more slides, but I've already gone long enough. Let me go to the end. What I've tried to do today is introduce you a model that explains how emotion functions and particularly solves the problem of fear. And the crucial thing is that the security, the styles you've learned in parenting often play a crucial role. But to change them, you need to change the emotion. Notice I didn't talk about cognition any time today. I talked about directives, verbal directives, but they were carrying emotion. The emotion was the change. That's the message I want to leave you with. Part of the reason I like the model is that it provides a clear understanding of this. Thank you for listening and being patient with me during this long time, and I'll let Dr. Armstrong finish our hour here.
All right, well, yeah, thank you, Dr. Veenstra, for the wonderful presentation. I think it's useful to hear kind of all the levels and how it all works together, even though I've heard it before. So thank you for that. We do have a couple questions. One was your family of origin in Northern Scandinavia? If so, how does that fit with the parenting you've experienced as a child?
Actually, I probably know who asked that. Yes, my mother is Norwegian and Danish. And part of that Scandinavian culture is not to admit problems and to have sort of stoically try to just go on even though you feel them.
Okay, and I think a follow-up to that question, kind of setting it with what you just said, was do you think the cultural and genetic implications need to be incorporated into your model?
Actually, they should be. I didn't talk about them. The culture would be there. And actually, the genetics are that I have an anxious temperament. So does my mother. So does my second daughter. So does my grandmother on my mother's side. All of us are inclined this way. However, I have an older daughter and a wife, and both of them have an angry temperament that is very biological and very much inclines them to move much more to a disgust to disapproving if they needed to deal with the situation. So clearly culture and genetics are there. They're actually built into the model at the biological to the bottom and the cultural up at the 6th and 7th levels.
And so from what you're saying, it actually changes level of functioning rather than an application of the same level.
Well, it'll actually influence each of the levels, right? Um, that a driven dismissive style will actually impact each of the levels during the development. But as far as developing regulation of fear, it'll trap you at a certain level, yes.
Okay. We had another comment that it's valuable to hear your personal examples on how they kind of apply to use your model. So thanks for the personal disclosure.
I would have liked to share more, but time was short.
Then another question was, using your model, how do you approach the different origin of an undesirable emotion, such as fear of the unknown, like walking home from school alone, versus a fear of a specific situation, like a fear of heights? Can you couple them with the same corrective emotion, or how does the model explain that?
You do have to take into account what the stimulus is. And one of the things you need to know is that the amygdala is often responding to two very different things. Uncertainty is very frightening for the amygdala. That's an unknown, and that you can't use the same conditioning techniques because there isn't a clear stimulus. So if you have a clear stimulus, some of the conditioning techniques work much better. If it's something like uncertainty or the unknown, that's more a general sense of security that you need to develop. And so there are differences depending on what is causing the fear.
So kind of like you make alarm is the same, but your soothing mechanism has to be a bit different depending on the stimulus.
Yes, you're actually, this model isn't something you can just sort of put out manuals on, because part of what a good therapist is doing is reading the unique emotional, their self's understanding of it. The more you can make your intervention appropriate to the self structure of the person, the more effective it is. And people have very different self structures. So it's not easy to manualize.
All right. Any last questions that have been submitted to the chat or otherwise? Feel free to volunteer if you have any.
Well, I hope people got something useful out of this. It was trying to fly fast and high, and I can imagine that it would be difficult. I actually am willing to send people the handouts on my own. The med school doesn't want to get involved with that. And I've set up not a website, an email, Veenstra, SSLF at cox.net. Unfortunately, my computer isn't quite using it yet, but I'll get it to work. So if you really were interested in today, you can send a message to me at Veenstra, SSLF at cox.net, and I will try to send you back the handouts, which I think Dr. Armstrong has seen, and that'll give you an introduction to my model. But thank you for listening, and I hope this has been helpful. I was trying to share it's been terribly helpful in my own life. I don't think I would be, there was a tale I was going to tell you about my mother, but there isn't time, so we'll, well, I guess there is time, isn't there? Let me just end with this final story. Part of the coming to terms with my mother is probably about 30 years ago, as I was developing. I was down in the basement. We were getting some things out for upstairs. And I said, Mother, I'd like to talk to you. I realized that when I grew up, you oftentimes were busy, and told me that my problem was I thought too much. I felt not heard and abandoned. Fortunately, I've grown, and I feel like I can handle the problems better. But I'd like to be able to talk to you about those problems at times. And the thing you need to know is you don't have to fix them. You don't have to make them better. All you need at times is for you to listen to me. I'll solve the problems. She had this look like, and then she started to tear up and wanted a hug, and I hugged her. Okay, so that was important. But to finish the story, In 97, about 6 weeks after I had my left kidney removed and I'd been cut open from one side to the other, my mother called me and said my dad's prostate cancer had reached his spine and he was paralyzed and he was in the hospital, and said, "There's no need to worry. You don't need to come home. I'll take care of things." And she inadvertently mentioned that he had talked to God, which is not my father's usual thing. I got off the phone, thought for a minute, and called her back and said, "I'm coming." And she said, "Oh, you don't need to." Classic Scandinavian, reject. I said, uh, "It's my decision. I'm coming." So I drove up to Des Moines, went in there, and there's two interesting parts to the story. When I went to my father and said, "You were talking to God," he's not very religious, that my faith is important to me, he responded by, "Oh, it was just gas." And I said, "You sure you don't want to talk?" "No, I don't need to talk about it." Sad to say, my father was trapped in his shell. I haven't told you a lot about it. But as we went home that night, we waited for a while, and then the call came from the hospital that my father died. And I took my mother back. And then in that final time, we could actually sit and just simply share the emotional presence. As I left town, I thought I could have never done that if I had just continued to be an engineer, worried about solving problems in life. You have to learn about emotions to be able to do that. And you can learn to change those patterns. So that's a story I'd like to share with you at the end of this time. So I'm guessing that we're done for now. So thank you all for listening, and I will say goodbye.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in, and thank you, Dr. Veenstra.
Thank you. You're welcome.